Well, thanks very much, Dr. Bruce. It was an important comment that you made in terms of being careful how we present things, because this field is so polarized. And as I've been looking into the literature, both the scientific literature and even the popular literature, it's very obvious what side the person is on. And I'm trying to find a middle ground between these things. That's one thing. And the other thing I would point out is that this is happening so quickly, these changes, that the scientific studies are really incomplete. We're just kind of wondering what is going on. But one of the challenges is, you know, you can't do follow-up research for many years because the issue hasn't been around for that long. And there aren't that, I mean, some of the studies are just a small number of people, or the statistics aren't really that strong. And so everything that I'm going to say makes sense biologically, at least it does to me, but I'll have a hard time saying this is exactly what happens. So everything is with somewhat of a tentativeness, and please take that in mind. So what I'm going to do in this talk is first talk about definitions and distinctions, because clarity of the ideas is really important. And then I'll talk about two models of gender dysphoria, which I really see as distinct. There may be some overlap, but I really see them as different, early and late onset. And then I'll look at how we as Christians can approach this topic as well. Or how Christians do, and then what do we do when we see that sort of situation. Okay, so first of all, definitions. What is gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria is actually the stress associated with the incongruence between one's biological sex and one's perceived gender. Now, it used to be that if there was that incongruence, they would call that gender dysphoria, but now it's really the stress that's associated. Some people could have incongruence but not be stressed about it. Gender is really an internal sense of who you think you are. It's not how someone acts. So if you say someone is a girl and she acts like a tomboy, that's irrelevant. It's really who you sense that you are. I also want to distinguish it from same-sex attraction. It's not the same, although it can be confused as such, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And as I mentioned before, there are two models, early onset and late onset. So, how does gender develop? So I'm going to apologize in advance for throwing a fair bit of biology at you. If you don't understand it, don't worry. I will summarize it at various points and kind of look at, hopefully the points will be somewhat clear. Okay, sexual development. So now I'm talking about biological sex. How does it develop? Well, early on in development, about 6 weeks of age, the person's reproductive organs are what we call bipotential. It hasn't differentiated one way or another. If the embryo or fetus is a male, then that person would have a Y chromosome. It has an SRY gene on that. That gene gets turned on, and it stimulates these primordial structures here, which now is not sure if it has going to be a male or female, but it'll stimulate to go in that way so that testes develop. And then as testes develop, testosterone will be produced. That will cause the various male reproductive organs to develop. These are kidneys, so we won't worry about those. But the male structures, earlier on, it's actually both male and female are there. The male will develop, the female will regress. However, if the embryo or the fetus is female, then you don't have an SRY gene, and then the female development will occur. So that's biological sex. What about the brain? Well, that happens a little bit later. So as the testes develop, testosterone levels, they will increase. That testosterone will then go into the brain, and it'll stimulate masculinization. So here's the potential source of confusion. We tend to think of testosterone as the male hormone, estrogen as the female hormone, but what actually happens is there's an enzyme called aromatase, and it can convert testosterone to estrogen. And studies in rodents, especially rats, have shown that it's actually estrogen that masculinizes the male brain. Those studies are not ethical to do in humans, but definitely aromatase is present in male brains, male fetuses, and there is estrogen in there. And so maybe the same thing happens, or to a certain extent, it's not entirely clear. But I think I will get back to this business of estrogen and the hormonal balance between the two. So Now I want to talk about the brain sex model of gender dysphoria, where the hormones come into play. This is the early onset gender dysphoria, and it's been around for a long time. And what seems to be happening then is the biological sex may be male, and so then the reproductive organs will develop as a male. However, later on, as the hormones get into the brain, maybe that process doesn't develop as it should, and then you may have male reproductive organs and a female brain, or vice versa. I don't want to spend a lot of time going through these various conditions, androgen insensitivity, or, those are things. But basically, in all those cases, what we have is an imbalance between testosterone and estrogen in the brain, either in males or females, and what you find is a higher incidence of a gender incongruence. It's not a complete correlation, but there is a higher incidence. So this seems to be some kind of clue that an imbalance between estrogen and testosterone is involved in changes in the sex of the brain. A very interesting case is Greg Eilers, whom I've corresponded with considerably, but I've never met him personally. He's a retired Lutheran pastor. He had lifelong gender dysphoria. He thinks it's because his mother took DES. That was one of the examples I mentioned before. Back in the 50s, this is a synthetic estrogen that mothers would take to prevent miscarriage. And what they found is the daughters of these pregnancies had a lot of reproductive issues, and so they stopped prescribing it. But a lot of the sons actually are gender dysphoric. And so he had lifelong gender dysphoria. He fought it, he did whatever he could, even went to faith healers, which is something that Lutherans don't do. And eventually he had to resign from the ministry. His first wife left him, but his second wife stuck with him through this. So he transitioned from Greg to Gina. And he went through surgery, a variety of surgeries, including bottom surgery. But part of it was that he had to take estrogen treatments to kind of feminize his facial features. He grew breasts. And when he started taking the estrogen, the dysphoria went away, and he no longer felt like a woman. So he thought, oh, this is great. So he went off the estrogen, it's all fixed, and it came back again. And so the only way he can remain as a man is to take estrogen for the rest of his life. So he doesn't understand it, but it works for him, and other people, he knows other people who have the same sort of thing as well. So hormones seem to be involved in some way. Exactly how, we're not really sure. Now, here's something that you may have heard of if you've looked into this field somewhat. There is a dilemma in treatment. So this is dealing with early onset gender dysphoria. Most cases, the proportion varies from study to study, but most cases of early onset gender dysphoria, it resolves or desists when these children enter puberty. It just goes away. I think what happens is the levels of the sex hormones increase dramatically, and it overrides anything else that was happening before. Most of these people actually end up as same-sex attracted, but they're not gender dysphoric. But for the ones where the condition persists, the symptoms intensify, and then it gets really hard to deal with. And that's really the stressful time, as let's say a natal female starts growing breasts and she's actually gender dysphoric. That's really a stressful situation for them. And we really don't know which ones will persist and which ones will not. And that's really a big question. Now, one of the treatments that has been done is to prescribe puberty blockers. So these are hormones that block the increase in sex hormones that accompany puberty. And the idea is it's going to buy time to see whether these people, whether the condition will desist, and therefore you don't have the massive stress that happens with puberty. There are concerns about this because, well, what's the effect of dropping or blocking puberty for a couple of years? However, and so this treatment has largely replaced the watchful waiting approach. The problem with this is that those puberty blockers also block the desistance. In other words, what you're doing is you're blocking the very thing that will make the gender dysphoria stop in those cases, in most cases. And so people who have puberty blockers, they continue and they will transition because the dysphoria doesn't go away. And so this is a major dilemma in prescribing or in dealing with early onset gender dysphoria. Okay, so let me summarize this. The early onset, it's present at a low frequency. It seems to be caused by a hormonal imbalance in masculinization or sexualization of the brain. Most cases resolve during puberty, but some persist, and it can cause extreme distress. So these are cases that I think are real. These people do not want to have this situation. They fight it as much as they can, but it really is gender dysphoria. And it has existed. This is not a new thing. It's been going on for a considerable length of time. So now let's move to the second model, the later onset. And in these cases, there is no evidence of gender dysphoria or incongruence in childhood. And then all of a sudden, puberty hits and something happens. And we're trying to figure out what's going on, and is the biological basis any different? Well, this is the one where I'm quite concerned, because there's recently, now this is a study done in the UK, you can see there's a dramatic increase in females. So the early onset, it's increased somewhat, but not a whole lot, but it's a dramatic increase in females in late onset. Males increased as well, but not nearly as much. So why is it so much higher then? And so some of the reasons that may be going on is, maybe we're better at diagnosing it because gender dysphoria really has a much higher prominence now, and maybe our culture is more accepting of it, and therefore people who have it are willing to come out. But that still doesn't explain why there's so many more females than males. So is something else going on? So recently there was a study done by Lisa Littman at that other Brown University in Rhode Island. And I'm sorry for all the words here, but I need to read, especially the ones that are underlined there. She talks about a rapid onset gender dysphoria. So she did a study where she was looking at online forums of parents of kids who had or were trans, described themselves as trans. And so they found that this condition appeared first during puberty or even after its completion. The onset seemed to occur in the context of belonging to a peer group where one, multiple, or even all of the friends have become gender dysphoric and trans-identified during the same time frame. So in other words, it happens in clusters. And the word social contagion has come up. And also these parents have reported that their children, they really, they were on the internet all the time. And so that's what their association was with other people online rather than people in person. And so she was describing this phenomenon. When that paper came out, her university pretty much disowned her because they didn't like what she was saying. And this paper has been challenged considerably, but the phenomenon exists. As I read other people talking about it, this really does happen. So as I was looking into this a little bit further, I read something else that really struck me. And this has to do with I'll just put the slide up. TikTok, and people who have tics would, I guess, put it up on TikTok, and people will be watching TikTok videos of people having tics, and over time they would pick it up themselves to the point where they couldn't stop doing the tics themselves. And so their parents made them, go see someone, what's going on? You don't have Tourette's or tics or anything like that, what's going on? But the language in these two papers is really striking, because they said it's an epidemic diffusion over a relatively short period of time and suggests suggestibility and behavior modeling. Another paper that looked at it, mass sociogenic illness spreading spontaneously through a group. Does that sound like what I was just talking about with gender dysphoria? It does. Now you say, well, this is just tics. Gender dysphoria is a much more serious condition, but I was just struck by the similarity between the two different conditions. So you might say, well, what does that, can we actually change our gender by some of these sorts, by suggestion or social contagion as it's talking about? Could there be external influences? And so what I'll talk about for the next little while is, well, I'm thinking that stress, anxiety, depression, can really contribute to an instability of one's mind-body connection. And that is developing in adolescence, and if these stresses can occur before the brain is fully mature, which is in the early 20s, these children may be more susceptible to gender dysphoria. So let me unpack this somewhat. Okay, adolescents are highly stressed. Any of you who teaches at colleges or college students yourselves know you're a lot more stressed than students used to be a long time before. This was a study done on the on the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic. Those numbers are phenomenally high. But even I think that is really high numbers of depression and anxiety. And other studies that have cited down there show that there's been an increase for the last 20 years. And so right now, our younger people are incredibly depressed, anxiety, and things like that. Social isolation, thanks to COVID, can also exacerbate these sorts of things. So that is our population in general. What about children with gender dysphoria? So this is one study that was done in Australia, but they said the results are pretty much the same everywhere. If you look at the comorbidities that these people with gender dysphoria have, it's phenomenally high. Family conflict, mental illness of parents, separation from important figures, then get bullying, depression, anxiety, things like that. Now, I have to note, it's not clear what's cause and effect here, right? If you have someone who has gender dysphoria, they may well be bullied, they may well be depressed, anxious, they may have family conflict. So, the connection between the two, or what's cause and effect, is really not clear, but the correlation is really strong. But what does that have to, so how would they actually affect gender, one's sense of gender? So what I want to talk about is, and again, I apologize for the neuroscience stuff in here, but this is an oversimplification, but we can think of the brain as basically having two parts. We have our cortex on the outside, which is more the thinking part of our brain, and we have structures deeper in that we call subcortical, limbic system, things like that, that are more reactionary components. And the two do not develop at the same time. So earlier on, the subcortical structures, they're present in children, but then as the children go into adolescence and young adulthood, then the cortex matures more, and the really interactions are going on. And so what happens is, in children, they would have emotional responses to stresses. But as you tend to develop a little bit further, those same sorts of stresses will give you a different type of response, not so much an emotional response, but more a cognitive, thinking about, oh, this is what the situation is, I can work my way through that. And so that change in how we respond to stressful situations, that encourages a more logical and reasonable response to stresses. To carry that a little bit further, our sense of self. So this is a study that was done where they would ask people questions that make them self-reflect. And then they look at what parts of the brain are activated. And what they found is in children, this is the part of the brain that was activated. Now remember, that was the immature part. And so this is words from the paper that they suggested that these children were actively constructing their self-descriptive attributes. So making things up as they go along. If you ask the same sort of questions in adults, they use information they already have. They use a different part of the brain, and so they're not making up things. They're based on what they already know. And so our sense of self is something that develops in adolescence as well. And to carry this even a little bit further, these are a couple studies that were done to look at people who are transgender, and what about their sense of self? And it seems like regions of the brain that are involved in body perception in the context of self, they are underdeveloped. Now again, it's not clear what's cause and effect. It could be that it didn't develop and therefore they didn't have a strong sense of gender, or it could be the other way around. But basically, a perceptual ambiguity on your sense of self could also lead to gender ambiguity, and that's what they said in the paper. And again, there's a correlation. Causation is not entirely clear. So I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. Throw a little bit more at you that I found really surprising when I was studying it a bit further. So how do we perceive things? So I teach anatomy and physiology, and we talk about different parts of the brain that are involved in, let's say, seeing things, hearing things, touching things, et cetera, et cetera. Intuitively, you would think when you encounter something, we would process our those sorts of information. So we'd hear something, we'd see something, we'd touch something, all that stuff goes into our brain, then our brain just kind of says, oh, this is what it is, and therefore I'm going to respond and construct our reality. Now the problem is when you do that, we're always a step behind, and we're kind of trying to catch up to things. And what our brain actually does is it kind of predicts things in advance. So we predict reality based on partial information. And this is started with a TED Talk by Neil Seth, but there's the book that he wrote. He's a neuroscientist in the UK. And what he calls them controlled hallucinations. It's his best guesses. So you get a little bit of sensory information and you guess on what it is, and that may get corrected over time, but that way you can kind of be ahead of things. Now, so to give you an example of that, we think of optical illusions. Now, you all see that upside down triangle on there? No, you don't, because there is no upside down triangle there. It's actually just a bunch of corners here and spaces, but our brains are constructing what we think is actually happening. And so, and again, you think, well, that's just seeing things outside, but what about internally? What are we sensing internally? So we call that interoception. So what our brain does is our brain is getting information from the body, like say body temperature, blood pressure, blood chemistry, all those sorts of things, and then it takes all that information to decide what's going on in our body, and therefore we need to respond. So we use interoception, that's what we call internal perception, and so then our brain processes that information to derive a physiological representation of the state of the body. Sometimes it can guess wrong. For example, people who might have an anxiety attack may think they're being attacked and whatever, the brain guessed wrong. But it still does happen. So those of you who've taken some biology, I'm sure you're familiar with the term homeostasis, which is maintaining things at a constant level. Oxygen levels, CO2 levels, blood pH, all those sorts of things. And that involves internal organs. I'm kind of surprised at how slow those changes actually are. And again, if you just rely on that, you're always a step behind. So what the brain does on top of that is something called allostasis, which I don't read in my textbook, but I tell my physiology students about it. And so what's happening is the brain is predicting what's going to happen and making physiological changes to help you. For example, before you even take a bite of your food, your digestive system is working, right? Because it knows what's coming. It may guess wrong, but it does. Before you start a race, you're going to start breathing harder, your heart's going to start pumping faster, you're going to be releasing glucose into your bloodstream, etc., because you know what's coming. So that's kind of a predictive type of thing. And so our brain is still guessing what's going on. It's really that guessing aspect that I want to work on. Now, not only do we have this, there's also an emotional aspect to interoception, which I found was really quite profound. So, now, again, I'm sorry for all the anatomy stuff. This blue area, that's the part of the brain where your touch sensations occur. So our body is actually mapped out around that information. So if I get touched here, that signal goes up to a certain part of my brain, which says, where did I get touched? What kind of touch was it? You know, hot, cold, sharp, dull, or whatever, that sort of stuff. Okay, so that's what we normally talk about in sensation. However, there's also something called a social touch. And this is a soft, stroking, gentle touch. And it goes to a different area of the brain. That area of the brain is involved in our mind-body connection. And these were two studies on people who didn't have the other type of touch, but did have this one. And when they got stroked, it felt good, but they didn't know how. Now, Kelly Kapic, I don't know if you know Kelly Kapic, Covenant College, he wrote a book and he talked about this social touch, especially students in dorms and things like that. You're always touching each other and bumping each other, and you're getting that social touch. But what if you were isolated, you spend all your time on the computer, and that's your only social form? You're not getting the social touch. You may not be constructing your sense of self. So, socially isolated adolescents, they lack this social touch, and therefore their mind-body connection does not develop. If you combine that with stress and anxiety, that might make them more susceptible to these suggestions of gender dysphoria. Now you might say, okay, come on, you're really reaching here. But I want to show you a couple new topics that kind of relate to the idea that our sense of gender is not as rigid as we might think it is. So, how strong is that mind-body connection? Has anyone heard of the rubber hand illusion? There's some really neat YouTube videos on that. Some of you may have heard of it. And so what happens then is you take a person and you set them on a table, so the participant has their arm there that they cannot see, and then they put a rubber hand that they can see, and then the experimenter strokes both of them at the same time. And then over time, the person gradually comes to see the rubber hand as being their real hand. And in fact, what you can do is you can take a fork and stab the rubber hand, and then people freak out because they think it's a part of their own body. Now again, think of someone who may be a biological female. She starts growing breasts, and if she's got gender dysphoria, she doesn't see them as part of her body. And there's actually studies to show that they don't see that as a part of their body. And so it's actually the soft touch that enhances that effect. So that doesn't last very long, but the phenomenon is there. Again, what does that have to do with gender? Well, here's another study that was done along the same lines. So what they would do is they would take the participants would lie on a table, they would wear virtual reality goggles, and through those goggles they would see a body of the opposite sex that they are. And they would do the stroking of the body, just like in the other experiment, not on sexual parts of the body, just like in the belly and the leg and things like that. But over time, and again, they need to be synchronized with what they're seeing through the goggles and what they're feeling with their body. And over time, their sense of gender changes from one to the other. The controls, the green one is if they're not synchronized, it doesn't work as well. And if the two are what you see is the same sex as your own body, nothing happens. Now, these are well-adjusted individuals who are adults, and it's really a temporary thing. But you think, but what about if you've got a piling up of a whole bunch of things that are going on? Maybe that's going to tip you over to the edge where you could actually think you are the opposite gender. So, to summarize this, our perception, including of our own bodies, involves best guesses. They get corrected, but they are best guesses. Our body ownership develops profoundly during adolescence, but is surprisingly malleable. Our adolescents are increasingly stressed and anxious, and that affects this development of the mind-body connection. And social isolation may further destabilize that, and then social media and our affirming culture, because if you say, I think I'm trans, you have a whole community willing to come out and help you along, because they think that's really what it is. So, again, this is still somewhat tentative, and maybe people who are not happy with what I'm saying here, and I may be wrong, but these are some of the things that I'm seeing that are backed up by what we see in the literature. Okay, so how do we as Christians look at gender, or what are the Christian perspectives on that? Clearly, the Bible does not address gender dysphoria. However, there are principles that we see in Scripture. The binary of sex and gender are rooted in creation, male and female, He created them. I always get a little bit hesitant because that's what we call a clobber passage. However, if you look throughout Scripture, we see this binary and a complementarity between male and female. We don't see a spectrum, we see a complementarity. Marriage, Tim Keller said the Bible begins and ends with a marriage. And even the church is the bride of Christ, so we got that complementarity there as well. And even many of the Old Testament prophets talk about adultery or idolatry being adultery in that sense. But when people have gender dysphoria, how do we deal with this? And so there are three positions that I'll outline. One is the integrity position, one is the disability or disorder position, and the diversity position. These come from Mark Yarhouse, who is a psychologist, who is a Christian psychologist, but looking at sexual issues, including gender dysphoria. I'll show a picture of his book, or some of his books afterward. So, the integrity view says that humans were created binary, male and female. Any deviation from that is sin, so it's a moral problem. And therefore, the goal of treatment is for the gender to conform to sex. If you don't have that, then you have not succeeded. So the pros of that position is it takes Scripture seriously. It sees that complementarity that we have. And indeed, some people who were unbelievers came to faith, who were transgender, they reverted back to their original sex. There are some examples of that. Laura Perry is one. On the other hand, this position doesn't really look at biological causes. And I think the early onset gender dysphoria really is a biological cause. And these people cannot just change just by strength of will. A little nervous about the term over-realized eschatology. What that really means is we live in a world of already but not yet, right? Christ has overcome, and things are changing, but we're not there yet. And I think conformity of sex and gender just may not be realistic at this point. And these people, we can't do that. And so that's a concern I have with the integrity view. The second view is disability or disorder. And again, it holds the position that humans were created binary, male and female. However, this is a fallen creation, and things are not as they should be. And if that's the case, then maybe some transitioning might be necessary simply to relieve the distress that these people are experiencing. The pros of this is that it takes Scripture seriously and it recognizes the effects of sin, the complete effects of sin on the creation. On the other hand, it allows people to alter their body to conform to their mind. Well, which is really you, your brain or your body? And we got to be careful not to let one win over the other, because we are both mind and body. And then the third view is a diversity view that says the male-female binary is descriptive in creation, but it's not prescriptive. In other words, you can have other things as well. And so those other possibilities may, because our creation is diverse, and maybe people's genders are diverse as well. On the pro side, and this is one of my concerns, is the church is not very good at dealing with people who have gender dysphoria. In fact, one of my biggest issues is these people often see no place for themselves in the church, and they leave the church. And this view actually does show love to all humanity as image bearers of God. The other views do as well, but the stress that people experience as believers with this condition is really strong. On the other hand, it prioritizes the mind over the body, and we have to be careful to say, well, is that really you? Do we similarly affirm depression and something like anorexia as we do if someone says that they're trans? No, we don't. If there's a problem, we need to deal with it. So there are different positions that Christians hold. I tend to hold to the disorder view, the middle one, but all of these have certain things that support them as well. To summarize then, we have two models of gender dysphoria, the brain sex and the body ownership one. And the brain sex really is, because of our hormonal imbalance, our gender switches from one to the other, or develops oppositely to our sex. The body ownership is really an incomplete connection between the mind and the body, and therefore the sense of gender could change as well. The late onset gender dysphoria is rapidly increasing in frequency, and I think largely because the increase in stress in our culture and things like that. And surprisingly to me, our sense of gender is not as fixed as we might think. So how do we respond as Christians? First of all, empathize. Every person struggling with gender dysphoria is different. We need to look at them. We cannot generalize or jump to conclusions. And when I first jumped into this field, I literally did, then it's easy to jump to conclusions, and we really shouldn't do that. We really need to consider the circumstances, but also the deeper issues. I mentioned Mark Yarhouse earlier, and what he says is we've got a lot of comorbidities. We need to address them before we can deal with the gender issues. Each person needs a careful and prayerful support because they've got a lot of issues that are going on in their minds. And you should seek out Christian counselors, and not just Christian counselors, but Christian counselors who are trained in this area. And because a lot of damage can be done by people who are well-meaning but really don't understand what the issues are. So I'll stop there. But I'm just going to throw this slide up here. So this is Mark Yarhouse, and Julie Sadusky was a co-author on the other two. It was that first book a few years ago that made me realize that, yes, gender dysphoria is real, because he's counseling many people with that. The last book here is really directed to counselors and to help them to work. It's got worksheets in it and things like that. So if any of you are planning to be involved in counseling in some way, I would strongly encourage you to get that book. And briefly, another couple possibilities. Greg Eilers, I mentioned before, this is an autobiography of his gender dysphoria issues. Preston Sprinkle has an organization that also helps people, not just with gender dysphoria, but also the same-sex attraction and things like that as well. So these are possibilities. And I think I will stop there and entertain any questions.
Thanks so much. Is there a slide after that for...
Yeah, if you want to know about steps in transitioning, I can do that. If you go to the very
end, yeah, so leave it here. So go back one, go back. Okay. So I bungled it, and there's a little button that I was supposed to push play on the Slido. So if you tried to go to 4036783 earlier and you couldn't, it's because I failed you. So I apologize. But do go to 4036783. We already have a bunch of questions. So I'll just get at it. So there's one long statement that doesn't actually contain a question. So I'm going to try to frame it as a question to you. Aren't there characters in the Bible who don't behave according to traditional gender roles, or they don't do things that are physically typical of men or women? So Jacob preferred to be with his mother at home. He wasn't the hunter in the fields. How does that help us understand or think about, how do characters in the Bible help us think about this issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, if you read Proverbs 31, the good wife, and you switch the pronouns from female to male, it reads very much like she's, what we would think is male. Now, that's a distinction that I had raised before. Gender is your internal perception of who you are, of who you think, whether you're male or female. The way you behave is something entirely different. And so you could have Jacob preferring to be at home with his mother. What were the other examples that you mentioned?
Joseph was given an ornate robe by his father. Deborah was a judge of Israel.
Yeah. And so those are really actions. And our society, whether it's the culture in general, but even our church culture, often says women should do this and men should do this, and they may not be biblically derived. And so therefore, what's wrong with a male wanting to be with his mom, being in the kitchen? Some of the best chefs are male. So that's the distinction between whom you perceive yourself to be versus how you're acting.
Good. Can transgender surgeries be harmful to the human body? Could transgender?
Harmful in what way? Yeah, definitely. The puberty blockers, certainly, they have impacts on bone density, but anyway, any kind of surgical transition will prevent your reproductive capabilities and prevent you from having children. There's another trans person I know, so she's a male to female, and she intentionally went through puberty as a male, even though it was really stressful, and now has 2 children with her wife, if you try to get that. So this is Chris Rosado. He's an organist. You can look at him on the web. But she says, I have gender dysphoria. I sense myself as female, but I am the father to my 2 children. And in that way. But if you get surgery before you reach puberty, you won't be able to have children.
What treatment would you recommend for early onset versus late onset gender dysphoria?
I'm not a clinician, I'm a biologist. Can I escape from that? I would just go back to what Mark Yarhouse is saying. Just treat each case on an individual basis and try to find out what are the comorbidities, can we resolve that? I would suggest, and this Chris Rosato guy mentioned, or woman now, said you need to let them go through puberty to see if it's going to desist or not. And if it does, the stress will be so intense you need to do something. And then what you do as little as possible to reduce the stress.
Could gender dysphoria be related to spiritual warfare?
A lot of things are related in some way. In many ways, I could say that. God could give someone gender dysphoria, and there could be a spiritual battle, because I say a lot of people who are gender dysphoric leave the church because they don't see a home for themselves in the church. So that's spiritual warfare as well. There could be other things as well. I mean, spiritual warfare is everywhere. But as itself, is it strictly gendered spiritual warfare? I'd be really hesitant to say that, because then you just say it's just a spiritual thing and the body has nothing to do with it. And I don't think that's the case.
So, one question, I'm going to ask the question. I think you tried to address it, but it's important enough for an audience member to ask. So, you said earlier that bullying, anxiety, depression, and things like that are what cause gender dysphoria. Wouldn't you say that these could be the result of experiencing gender dysphoria and transitioning?
Yes, it could be. And it's really hard to tease apart. And I think one thing can feed upon the other. So if the child is already socially isolated and has stress and anxiety, that could make the idea of gender dysphoria that much more likely to happen, and it could feed on itself.
Could you say something, this is my question, could you say something more about the social contagion with the women and the females in the UK experiencing more of that?
It's not just the UK, it's here as well. And yeah, I didn't mention that. I think it's much more difficult for girls than boys to go through adolescence. Our sexualized culture, women are looked upon as sex objects, so we can talk about Me Too and all that sort of stuff, but the culture is taking a long time to change and to improve on that. So I would think there may be many girls who it's much more attractive for them to want to be boys than for boys to want to be girls. And I think that's a reason why there's so many more girls with the late onset gender dysphoria than the boys. So does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, I may not be knowledgeable enough to frame my question, so much less evaluate your answer, honestly.
But I think that may be an explanation that it is much harder for a girl to go through adolescence than a boy.